Taoiseach, a few weeks ago, a young family in Dublin saw their lives unravel. They were renters living with their two small children, and like anyone else, they just want a secure home for their kids to grow up in and to build their lives as a family. But their nightmare began when they were evicted. Their lives were turned upside down. They now sleep in emergency accommodation. It's hard to imagine the trauma for this young family and their two small children. It's hard to imagine how you even begin to explain to a child why they're being uprooted from their home and placed in emergency accommodation, with their parents unable to answer their questions about what will happen next because they themselves don't know. Another family, Taoiseach, in Bray, who are currently also homeless. Their mother, Lauren, is a nurse. She now lives in her car because she can't find anywhere remotely affordable to rent. She's had to send her two children to live with relatives because she can't find a home for them. Can you imagine, just imagine, how heartbroken that mother felt as she was forced to make that decision? How confused the children must be. Taoiseach, these families' experiences are not unique. In fact, they are sadly all too common in modern Ireland because of government's failure to get to grips with the housing crisis. Figures from the Department of Housing revealed on Friday that 12,259 people in this state now live in emergency accommodation, a new record on your watch, Taoiseach, a staggering figure. A figure that should never ever be normalised. It includes 3,594 children living in emergency accommodation. Let me say that again, Taoiseach. As we speak, there are 3,594 children who are in emergency accommodation in this state. And of course, we know that the real homeless figure is much higher, as these numbers don't include people sleeping on sofas in their family's spare room or indeed in their cars. Children uprooted from schools, uprooted from their routine, wondering why they can't play with friends in their neighbourhood anymore. Taoiseach, homelessness is increasing. Your government decided to end the eviction ban without safety net in place to protect renters. You were warned time and again that this was a bad decision, but despite this, you went ahead with it. You rejected Sinn Féin's plan to extend the eviction ban and to put in place protections for renters. And the really sad reality now is that despite how shocking the current figures are, we're not even at the peak yet. There is now a real risk that hundreds more children and their families will add to these heartbreaking figures in the course of this summer. So, Taoiseach, can I ask you, what interventions are you making today, tomorrow and next week to prevent more children becoming homeless?
Thank you, Deputy McDonald. Taoiseach.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Deputy, for raising this very important question. And I acknowledge that we have a real and serious problem of rising homelessness in Ireland. Roughly 12,000 people, in fact more than 12,000 people today in state-provided emergency accommodation. And there is emergency accommodation available for almost everyone who needs it. But emergency accommodation is not the solution. We seek to avoid people having to use emergency accommodation in the first place. If they do have to, we seek to get them out of emergency accommodation into a secure tenancy as soon as possible. About half will spend 6 months in emergency accommodation, most less than a year, but in the life of a child that can be a very, very long time. And I acknowledge that. But it's important to point out it's not the same 12,000 people all the time. People might spend a few weeks, might spend a few months in emergency accommodation, sometimes unfortunately longer. But we do our best to avoid them becoming homeless in the first place and then get them out of homelessness into secure tenancy as soon as we can thereafter that. In terms of solutions, Deputy, the main solutions are to prevent homelessness happening in the first place, and the second is to continue to increase the amount of social housing that we're building all the time in order to increase the social housing stock that we have so that people and families can be in more secure state-provided social housing rather than the private rented sector. So in terms of what we're doing to prevent homelessness, we're continuing to fund NGOs and charities like Threshold, for example, that will give people advice on their rights and work with them to prevent homelessness happening in the first place. Do that through the local authorities as well. We've allocated funding for 1,500 additional social homes to be leased. Roughly two or three people in each house. That's maybe 3,000 to 4,000 people prevented from becoming homeless in the first place. Also the tenant in situ scheme, which is now working very well. Authorisation for local authorities to buy 1,500 homes off the landlords when they're selling up. Again, 2 or 3 people in each house, about 4,500 people being prevented from homelessness in that way. And then, of course, continuing to ramp up the supply of social housing. Last year, more social housing built in the state than any year since 1975. We intend to improve on that again this year and again the year after. But we've a long way to go before we make up for the deficit that built up over the years. In terms of the eviction ban, Deputy, as I said before, 2 eviction bans have been imposed on a temporary basis. Both happened while I was in government. Certainly have no ideological objection to doing it, have done it twice. The problem is it doesn't work. And as we saw from the most recent eviction ban, the number of people in emergency accommodation continued to rise pretty much every month when it was in place. And all it does is make the problem worse in the medium and long term. In the medium term, because eviction notices build up and you have a bigger problem to deal with when you lift it. And then in the long term, most significantly, because it reduces supply of homes to rent. And that makes the problem worse in the long term. So I can see the attraction of it as a short-term policy, but we know from experience now from the 2 eviction bans that happened that it makes the problem worse in the medium to long term, and that's why it isn't a wise policy.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy McDonald.
So, Taoiseach, while you acknowledge the scale of this crisis, and that's perhaps welcome, there is no urgency or real sense of purpose that I hear from you in dealing with this issue. You list off the things that you say that you envisage as solutions to this crisis, but the reality is that the numbers of homeless people and homeless children continues to rise. So let me ask you again, now faced with this crisis, what do you propose to do now to put pace, to give urgency, and to ensure that we avoid the calamity of more children becoming homeless in the course of this summer? You know, an approach that says, mañana, we'll get it done at some stage, and it is not good enough when you're dealing particularly with the lives of young children. You've been in government for a very considerable length of time. You've sat around the cabinet table, you've designed the policies that have led to this calamity. Let me ask you again, what will you do now to change direction, to enhance things, and to give a real emergency response to these families who find themselves in crisis?
Thank you. Taoiseach.
Thanks, Deputy. What are we doing now? What are we doing today? First of all, additional funding for local authorities and NGOs this year to prevent people from becoming homeless in the first place. The second thing is additional emergency accommodation being provided, so that there is emergency accommodation for almost everyone who needs it, if they do need it. But of course, emergency accommodation is not a solution, it's a stopgap. 1,500 extra social homes being leased this year, ahead of what was planned. That can prevent maybe 3,000, 4,000 people becoming homeless. And also the tenant in situ scheme, which really is starting to work now, where local authorities can buy the house or buy the apartment if the landlord is selling up, thus making sure that the people in that house don't lose their tenancy and don't become homeless in the first place. They're the things that we're doing today, tomorrow, yesterday, and every day until we start seeing these numbers fall again. And I believe they will fall again.